Sunday with a Scholar. Today is our episode 3, and we have the honor of welcoming Professor Dr. Abhijit Gupta as our honorable speaker today. Before beginning with anything else, I would like to call our Center for Social Studies Director, Professor Dr. Prabal Rai Chaudhary, and our dearest Dean Sir, SKD Sir, to felicitate our speaker. So today Professor Gupta is going to talk about the books of Samuel Turner. And I have to mention that when Game of Thrones was in my syllabus in Masters, I was not a big fan of it. And I watched season 1, went to my professor and said, sorry ma'am, I cannot write anything on this. And yes, she was gracious enough to allow me to write it on Lord of the Rings. And before we do any further deliberation, we'll get to hear Professor Gupta. I'd like to request again our Dean Sir to just introduce our speaker, then we'll start.
Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, let me say this is a wonderful occasion for us because it's a great pleasure to invite Professor Abhijit Gupta to designate. Is it okay? Yeah. If you think of it, Professor Gupta doesn't need much of an introduction because he's a very well-known personality, a very famous professor of English in Kolkata today. He is the president of the Jadavpur University School, not president, the director of the Jadavpur University School of Cultural Texts in Goa. He is also the director of the Publications Division of Jadavpur University. He has published extensively, and his latest publications are in 2021, and this was by Cambridge University. He is also editor, long-time editor of a whole series, an editor together with my friend and this was a series which is being published now, and the next volume in the series is being published soon, in a few months' time. So, once again, thank you, Professor, for coming to us. This is the second time you are into this university, and the first time to the English department, so I feel very happy about it. Thank you so much.
That's good. Yeah, okay, great. Thank you everyone for such a warm welcome to this university. As Sir mentioned, I came here last year. I think that was with the Department of History. And it's a great pleasure to be in the Department of English and to get an opportunity of sharing some of my obsession, I might say, with books. As Sir mentioned, I look after publication division of Jadavpur University, which is called Jadavpur University Press. So I've become more of a publisher than a scholar. So you could possibly say Saturday with the publisher rather than Saturday with the scholar. Not sure which hat I feel more comfortable wearing. And of course, you will also know that this is a bit of a, what you call a clickbait title, The Books of Samuel Tarly. I realized once I arrived here that I may have given a similar talk last year. So if anyone here who was present last year, then I apologize in advance. There are some overlaps between what I said then and what I have read now. As you know, or as many of you know, Samuel Tarly was a character in Game of Thrones. Now, of course, Game of Thrones is fiction, but it's also based substantially on real history. I mean, just to give you one example, when you read about the early modern period in English literature, especially English history, you will come across the rivalry between the houses of York and Lancaster, War of the Roses. It's not very different from Stark and Lannister, York and Lancaster. The names themselves are echo that particular chapter in English history. And you will find that there's a great deal of comparisons, even in the way in which people die, and people die horribly in Game of Thrones most of the time, between what happened in the serial or the novels and what happened in English history. Now you will remember this perhaps from the 7th or 8th season of Game of Thrones, where there is a character called Samuel Tarly who is a bit different from everyone else in Game of Thrones. People don't really read in Game of Thrones. There are very few books. But of course, the whole Game of Thrones epic is actually a book. It's a tale. Which is being told by someone. It is a later story which someone is writing and preserving for future generations. And Samuel Tarly is the teller of this tale. Of course, it's not because George R.R. Martin has not finished and he has not written anything after Dance with Dragons. The Winds of Winter has not been published for over 10 years. We don't really know how this is going to end. But it's fair to say that Samuel Tarly is one of the researcher, scholar, the reader who's reading. He's the only person who's actually reading in the whole bloody mess of Game of Thrones, where everyone is killing each other, and he's trying to make sense by doing research. And in fact, you will find that it is owing to his research that certain very crucial things are known towards the end of the, at least the TV serial, about Dragon Glass and about the ancestry of Jon Snow. That's his name, right? Yeah, I forget. Jon Snow, yes. So the thing is, but this is, as I said, this is not a talk about Game of Thrones, though. This particular place, which is a library known as the Citadel, does occur in my talk. This is in the serial where, after gaining entrance into the Citadel, Samuel Tarly is looking on at amazement at all the books around him. It seems to contain the entire knowledge of the world. And my talk today is not so much concerned about books. I mean, there are two features in my title, The Books of Samuel Tarly. I'd like to talk about the reader, the figure, the person who reads, rather than the object book itself. Though, of course, the two are inseparable. We are sitting here in a classroom, and one of the earliest spaces of reading, I mean, this is a space for reading, which is classical, the library. Ever since the Library of Alexandria, or even going back further, these were spaces where people came to read because books were not widely available. The fact that we own books in our house, we have our own libraries, is a much more recent phenomenon, and I will explain the reasons for that. But one of the earliest spaces of reading was the library and also the classroom. People read in classrooms from almost the beginning of literacy, that is to say writing. If you think of the way in which knowledge or knowledge systems are preserved and transmitted, you will find that there are 4 major modes. One is orality, speaking, what is something which I'm doing right now, and this is also very old. The classroom is one of the things which has changed very little over the last few thousand years. I mean, other things have changed. The fundamental architecture of the classroom has not changed. You have a teacher, you have students, they take notes, maybe they sit on benches, sometimes they sit on the floor, but it is a
almost a changeless system of exchange of views. Now, you think of therefore four modes of knowledge production and transmission. First, orality, where you say, you speak, somebody else remembers it, and then that person passes that on, that knowledge on. Then writing is invented, what we call literacy. As a result, books become repositories of knowledge, not the human memory. Before books, before things were written down, people had to memorize things. And of course, memorizing is something which nowadays we look upon with some degree of disfavor. One should not memorize things, one should not learn by rote, one should try to understand things. But there's a history to this, and there's a reason why people at one point of time had to take recourse to memory. And that was because there was no other way to preserve knowledge. You had to remember it. So if you were singing or telling a story about an episode from an epic, it could be Ramayana or the Mahabharata, it could be the Iliad and the Odyssey, someone would have to remember it, either individually or severally, so that it could be repeated later. But of course, the human brain or human memory is an imperfect vessel. You cannot remember everything exactly. And as a result, throughout history, there was a great emphasis on how to remember. If you think of the early modern period, the 15th, 16th and the 17th centuries, you will find that one of the subjects in the curriculum was the arts of memory. You may have come across the name of Giordano Bruno, somebody who was burnt by the Christian Inquisition for professing that the universe was infinite and that there was no divine design behind it, but that it had design of its own. And there were other reasons why Bruno was burnt. But Bruno was also famous for being a great master of memory in what was called the Hermetic tradition. Those of you who have seen Sherlock, the series, will remember that Sherlock Holmes, played by Benedict Cumberbatch, refers to something called the Mind Palace. He sits down and said, the Mind Palace is in fact a creation of the 16th and 17th centuries, where this was created as a way to remember things. Bruno and his adherents were all masters of the Mind Palace. So, it is not something which Sherlock invents, it's something that he has been drawing on from. So, but again, coming back to literacy and writing things down, as a result of which these books are produced, then there is a further leap when printing happens. And printing, again, there's a complicated history of printing. We like to think that printing began in Europe in the 15th century. That's not entirely the truth. Printing began in China and Korea much before that. But printing with metal type began in Europe, and that kind of led to a multiplier effect in the way in which books were printed. And then the fourth technological age, which is one which we are currently living in, is the coming of the digital word or the machine-readable word. You see, how is the digital word different from machine-readable or printed words? Printed words are usually read by human beings at one point of time in the 20th century. Words could be read by machines, which is another paradigm shift. Anyway, I'm not going to talk about that period, really. I'm drawing your attention to this picture. This may have shown before. There's a Holy Bible, it's 1617. So this is after printing. But these books are chained to the shelves so that people can't steal them or take them away. Though we will find that in Game of Thrones, Samuel Tarly does run away with a few books. He steals them in the middle of the night from a forbidden section of the library. And of course, libraries such as these had to be very careful about the books that they had. Why? Because, of course, libraries always are, very particular about these things, but also because the book, either printed or handwritten. So you think of, if you go to the earlier picture, you're looking at a very large number of books. Now this is almost an impossible picture. You see, before printing, it would not be possible for a library to have so many books because you have to write everything by hand. It takes a lot of time to write a book legibly so that people can read. You need a lot of human labor to produce this output. But also in the case of Europe at least, you need the material, which is usually parchment or paper. The question is therefore, what do you, when you're talking about readers and reading, you have to ask yourself what kind of material and what kind of conditions constituted the act of reading. In the European world or in the Latinate world, books were made first on parchment, which is animal skin, and which is a scarce resource. You have to kill a cow or cattle, heads of cattle. One animal might yield a few pages. So only the very rich could afford books. You'd either have to be very rich or a monastery or a university or a court in order to afford books. Paper came from the Arab world. Paper was not invented in Europe. It came from the Arab world into Europe. And over time, paper became the paramount material for books, but more prestigious books were still printed or written on parchment, or even the more scarce vellum, the skin of an unborn calf, and so on and forth. Now compare this to, for example, the book in our part of the world. Now here you are looking at ancestors of paper and parchment. On the top you have something called papyrus, which is an earlier form, which originated in the Nile Valley in Egypt. It's a kind of a reed which grew in a marsh, and out of that reed you could create a material on which you could write. Some of the earliest surviving books, and I'm also calling them books. If these are books, let me go back a bit. If these are books, these are also books, but they look different, but perform the same task. In other words, they facilitate reading, or they make reading possible. At every point in the history of the book, we have to think about the material which is available. Papyrus was widely available. It was a naturally growing reed. And therefore, a lot of papyri, which is the plural for papyrus, have existed. They have been found in excavations, in archaeological digs. We know a lot, therefore, about the ancient world of Egypt and then Greece, in which papyrus was widely used. They were usually pieces of papyrus stuck together. They could have whole books or letters or poems. We have even found bureaucratic papyri, people complaining about lack of holidays. Things have changed very little you will find that there are people complaining about the bad quality of materials given to them, or some soldiers complaining about lack of travel, TA and DA given to them. This has always been a human predicament, that you don't have enough money. Even you will find in Mahabharata, when Bhishma, when he's lying on his bed of arrows and preaching his famous lecture on Rajdharma, or what a ruler should do. One of the things he tells his listeners is that if you employ soldiers, you must be particular in paying their expenses. Their reimbursements should be regularly paid. Otherwise, they'll not fight. For those of us who work in institutes, this is one of the major concerns. You spend money, you ask for reimbursement, and then you don't get it, and you are unhappy because you're not getting the money you already spent out of your own pocket. Even in the times of Mahabharata, this was a concern, that reimbursement should happen promptly, otherwise the morale of the army will collapse. But anyway, to return to this world of papyri, at the bottom you have palm leaves. This is a palm leaf manuscript, which is common to our part of the world. Again, like papyrus, the palm leaf was very common. I mean, how many palm trees are all over India, right? I mean, anywhere where the temperature or the climate is suitable, you have palm trees. And you don't need to slaughter cattle or animals. You just need to climb up a tree and get your palm leaf. I mean, so therefore, the material for the book here is plentiful. Any person, any scholar will have their own palm tree. And it's also not very difficult to write on palm tree. You need to get your palm leaf, cut them into size, boil them in water, cure them for a little bit, dry them. Then you have to sort of cut them to the same size, bore a hole through them, then you start the act of writing. So the hole is made before, and then you put the string through it, and then you have equal size palm leaves. Then you can start writing on it. And writing too is not very complicated. First you have to rub soot on it, and then you have to make marks on it with a iron pen or an iron stylus without ink, and once you rub the soot off, the letters will be something roughly like that. So, on the right you have the most remarkable form of the book that I can think of. Is this a book? Maybe it is. This is used by, or this was used by, the Incas in Peru in pre-colonial times, that is to say, before the Spanish colonizers came to Peru. This is known as quipu, K-Y-I-P-U, or quipu, however you spell it. It's a form of knots and strings, which is a kind of a language. So there are quipu readers. There are even now people trained in quipu reading. They can look at the knots and they can read them. One knot might mean that I'm not feeling well or something, or it has not rained, etc. Now, and these are again examples of the iron stylus I mentioned, with which you wrote on the palm leaves. You see, I must tell you a little bit therefore about this difference in reading between what we might call the Eastern world and the Western world. In the Western world, as I just mentioned, Samuel Talley was one reader among literally hundreds and thousands. He was the only one going to a library, trying to read, trying to make sense. And all the books were in one place, in a library. In the Eastern world, perhaps things were not so centralized. The reason for that, it is a complicated story, but the reason is that people began to write things down on a large scale, maybe one has to guess, with the rise of Buddhism and Jainism. You see, before the coming of the Buddha and the Mahavira, in what we might call the Vedic tradition, writing was not really considered very important. All the texts, the philosophical or the religious texts, were all remembered. Thus the word Sritis and the Shastras, they were all remembered and performed. Even today, in Hinduism, much of the textual production is oral or performative in religious or everyday rituals. So in the times of the later Vedic period, writing did exist, but it was for keeping accounts and property. If you gave some property to someone, you keep accounts. But it was not regarded with any great prestige. Those who wrote were, again, because it was also a very caste-ridden society, they were not very high up on the caste ladder. But then, with the coming of Buddhism and Jainism, or more correctly, with the preachings of the Buddha and Mahavira, after they had passed, it became important to record what the Buddha and the Mahavira had said, because there were disagreements. A sermon or a sutta by the Buddha, and there were many disciples who had heard what he had said, but what had he actually said? And there could be disagreements, so it became important to write things down. And thus, in the various monasteries that was set up, writing became a major preoccupation. You had to write. And everyone, therefore, especially if you were a bhikshu or a bhikshuni, or monk or a nun in such monasteries, one of your tasks was to write and create manuscripts. And thus, writing became general across all of South Asia. Palm leaves were important. Often the palm leaves used at that time were south of the Vindhyas. And that Buddhism arose in North Bihar and Nepal. So often one can think of a traffic of palm leaves across the spine of India. Sometimes you also used other kinds of material like the bark of trees like the birch tree in Kashmir, or the aloe tree in Assam. But so much so, you had here a man called Fashian, who we earlier called Fahian in history books. Now, after the Cultural Revolution in China, pronunciations and spellings have changed, so we now some call him Fashian. But what is interesting is any picture that you see of Fashian or Xuan Shang, earlier called Huan Sang, I'm not sure I'm getting the Chinese pronunciation correctly. You will always see him with a little backpack and carrying a lot of manuscripts, which of course are rolled manuscripts, not palm leaf. But it seems that the spread of Buddhism in China was owing to the travels of these men who were able to carry away a large number of manuscripts. So which meant that unlike the picture that you saw here, where books were chained, this was not the case in India. You did not need to chain books. You did not need to guard them so that someone did not steal. You could give them away. So you have, on the one hand, a culture which is in South Asia, where the making of the book is a inexpensive and easy process. Any scholar, as I said, you need to be able to climb a palm tree and get your palm leaves. That's about it. Nothing else, as opposed to Europe. So, therefore, Buddhism spread far and wide. This is one of the early readers. And when we think of readers, we also think of readers as people who carry books with them. Books are one of the most portable objects that you can think of. They are designed for easy portability. Again, not always. You see, if you look at these books, these do not look very portable. Look at this Bible. This is huge. When in 1452, 1450 actually, 1454, I forget, when Gutenberg printed the first ever printed book in Europe, the Bible, in 2 volumes, they were as large as this lectern. They were very large. They're not very portable, and you cannot read and do other things. You cannot multitask while reading a book. Nowadays we can read with one hand, we can cook with another. Though not a good idea to do that, but you're going to burn your dinner. But nonetheless, you can hold small. We are accustomed to holding a book in our hand. Let's give me this book. Let me demonstrate a point. So I can do this. I can actually. The thing is, I can do this, read like this, but a book like this could not be read this way. You needed a lectern to actually put the book and read it. So you have to actually turn it with both hands. The Gutenberg Bible was also very large. In this context, those of you who read the Kakababu stories by Sunil Gangopadhyay know that they're very entertaining, but sometimes there are also hilarious mistakes. For instance, there is one story in which a Gutenberg Bible is stolen, and Kakababu is tasked, Here Galen, and that at the climactic scene, the villain is escaping with the Gutenberg Bible under his. You can't do that. Gutenberg is 10 times as big. It is not possible to run away with it inside your jacket. Maybe a small version, a later edition, but it's not this. It's big. So of course, you don't research that much for Puja Shankha Kakababu, but had somebody pointed out gently to Sunil Gangopadhyay that the Gutenberg Bible is not that small, he would probably not have written it. So, for readers to carry books around, books have to be small, they have to be portable. And with that, this sort of allows us to think about the places where reading takes place and why people read. You see, if you think of why we read, maybe I can think of 3 classical reasons. Maybe there are more. You read because of pleasure. You like reading. Reading gives you pleasure. But even before reading for pleasure, there was reading for information. You read because you wanted to know something. You wanted to know the time of the rising of the moon and the tides of the moon. You wanted to know how to read, how to learn. You wanted to know a language. You wanted to know how to behave in polite society or behave in a court. These were etiquette books. You wanted to know how to cook something. This is all information, knowledge. And even before that, you read because it was a pious thing to do. You read a holy book because it contained a prayer or a ritual. Classically, the sacred books were the earliest. Then we have books of information. And then, much later, we have reading for pleasure. These are the 3 major reasons for reading I can think of. I mean, maybe you can think of more reasons. But these are classically the kinds of 3 stages in reading. And therefore, when you are thinking of why people read, you therefore also are led to think about where people read and how people read. So why, where and how are questions linked together. I want to therefore concentrate on this figure of this reader rather than that of the book or the author. Because the reader is always very difficult to, I mean, we know the book, somebody has written a book, we know the author's name is there. But the reader is a very shadowy creature. You don't know because the reader is the end user, so all books are for readers. Even banned books have their readers. But the readers don't usually leave accounts of what they read. They read and run, and they read and hide. And historically, it is very difficult to find out about the reader. We can only guess. In the early modern period or in the Christian era or before the Christian era, maybe men read most of the time. Women were not allowed to read. Even among men, few people were allowed to read. Maybe the priestly class were allowed to read. And then as literacy increased, various kinds of new readers came into being. You would not be allowed to read if you were from you would not have the opportunity to read if you were from a more depressed economic group, or you were from a lower caste, or if you were a woman. Historically, these things change. Children begin to read. Sometimes they're read out too. So therefore, one way of transmitting textual knowledge was one person who could read and reading out to other people. In the Indian tradition, that is called kathakota. There is one person who knows the story, and that person is telling the story to a number of listeners. So if you think of spaces of reading, you think of two kinds of spaces, public and private. The library is a public place of reading. The classroom is a semi-public place. Not everyone is allowed there, but members of the public. And then you have the private study. Now, we are accustomed to our own spaces of reading. We have our own desk, we have our own chair, we have our own bedroom, we have our own study sometimes to read in. Virginia Woolf tells us that to write a novel, you need a room of your own. Here you have one of the earliest depictions of private reading, a study. This is a man called Saint Jerome. Saint Jerome is he always has a lion. I mean, you want to go into Jerome's room, you have to encounter his lion. Of course, maybe there wasn't a real lion. But you see, if you look at Jerome's room, 7th century, you see the lineaments of a modern study. First, you need light to read. This is something which we often forget. Reading cannot happen without light. We live in a tropical country. We have very long daylight hours. We do not have to worry about sunlight. In temperate countries where there are where it is light for, sufficient light for 4 months a year, and remaining 8 months, the days grow longer and longer, you have less time for reading because there's no artificial lighting at that time. When Jerome is alive, of course, you have candles of various kinds, not wax or paraffin, but older forms of candle, tallow candles maybe. You need windows, you need large windows because you may want to make maximum use of daylight. But as you know, let's say in England or in Europe, most of the time it becomes dark by 4 o'clock. So after 4 o'clock, how are you going to read? You need artificial light. You have to be rich to be able to afford that light. Sun comes out only at 8 o'clock. And only in the 3 or 4 summer months, you have very long days when you can read. So historically, whenever we talk about reading, we also have to think about the light which is available for reading, because without light, no reading can take place. Nowadays, of course, we have electricity, artificial light, and even when light fails, if you have your Kindle, the Kindle can light itself, and you don't need any external source of light. But the history of lighting, history of legibility, is also intimately bound with acts of reading, and that is something which we often take for granted, that there was light enough. You often hear this apocryphal story about Bidyasagor, that he learnt his lessons under a street lamp. Actually, this is completely untrue. The street lighting had not been instituted on that scale. I mean, many of the stories you hear about Bidyasagor are apocryphal, but they are indicative of the struggle that he had to undergo in order to read. But the thing is, Bidyasagor would not need, he would, given the long daylight hours in India, he would have sufficient time to read. I mean, only at night, maybe not. Anyway, come back to Jerome. You can see that the light, this is a brightly lit room. You can see the modern desk, and on the top of the desk, a lectern. You can see the bookshelves. You can see bound volumes. And you can see Jerome, who seems to be an old man here, looking very closely at his book and writing. Here is another picture of Jerome, slightly more cartoonish. The lion seems very unhappy and rather pathetic, but the lion is there, you see. And there is a window. There is a scene from the window. There are two bookshelves, and some books are there. And here you have what seems to be students. This seems to be a classroom-like or some kind of a, it is classically the classroom structure. There's the teacher sitting at the desk. There are students with bags. Somebody is presenting their work to the teacher to read. And so this, and as I was saying, there is this question also of, as you grow older, your eyesight grows dimmer. Jerome, at this point of time, or earlier, does not seem to require artificial aids. But this man, I'm always confused whether it's Francis Bacon or Roger Bacon, possibly Roger Bacon, is wearing a very bizarre but early prototype of the spectacles. Now, where have you seen this? Of course, here in the Game of Thrones. See, it's exactly the same pair of glasses that this man in the Game of Thrones in the Citadel is the librarian who looks like this who are you? I mean, he looks at Samuel Tarly, and not only Samuel Tarly, he's horrified that there's a woman and a child, Gilly and her child. And he looks at him and says, who are you? And Samuel Tarly, I'm the new maester. This is and he provides his identification. And he looks at him with great suspicion. And then finally, very reluctantly allows him entry into the library. And they said, no women and children. I mean, when Gilly and the child are about to enter. But you can see where the makers of Game of Thrones got their inspiration from. They were using exactly the same. So again, as reading happens, and this is another reader. So you see, this is another picture of one of the early readers in history. As I said, readers are very difficult to pin down, but there are famous readers as well. This man is St. Ambrose. He's a famous reader. And he is written about by an even more famous man, St. Augustine. Now, St. Augustine, as many of you know, was one of the great Christian, early scholars and thinkers. And he wrote a very famous spiritual autobiography called Confessions. Okay, so in Confessions, St. Augustine, he had not yet become saint at that time. Augustine used to do tuitions in Rome. You see, he was a struggling scholar from north of Africa, which was part of the Roman Empire. He came to Rome to make a living by giving lessons to Roman young men. But he found it very difficult to make ends meet in Rome because all his students would join him for 1 month, and at the end of the month they would all leave without paying him his salary. And they would shift to some other teacher. I mean, they were Roman young men, extremely arrogant. The Roman Empire was the heart of the world. So in despair, he went to Milan, where there was a Christian ruler who was also a Holy Roman Emperor, Constantine, who was famous for patronizing Christianity. Remember that in the early centuries in our millennium, in the Common Era, Christians were a persecuted sect, and the Holy Roman Empire was slow to accept the rights of Christians. And it was only under Constantine, the Holy Roman Emperor, that Christianity became kind of recognized. So he went to Milan, which was where Constantine was the head, and he met the family, what we might call the cool guru, which his mother said. Mother Monica had told Augustine, when you go to Milan, meet Ambrose. So he went to Ambrose, and he was astonished to find that Ambrose was reading silently, without pronouncing or articulating the words. Now this was such a novelty that he records this in his Confessions. When he read, his eyes scanned the page and his heart explored the meaning, but his voice was silent and his tongue was still. He never read aloud. We would sit there quietly, for no one had the heart to disturb him when he was so engrossed in study. Perhaps he was afraid that if he read aloud, Some obscure passage in the author he was reading might raise a question in the mind of the attentive listener, and he would then have to explain the meaning or even discuss some of the more difficult points. So it's quite funny actually. Augustine is reading because he doesn't want to be bothered by questions, but it's also, and if you go online, you will find that this is apparently the first ever historical record of a man reading silently. This is not true. There are other records, but this is the most famous, of Ambrose reading silently. This is from Confessions, translated by a man with a charming name, R.S. Pine Coffin. So anyway, the name itself is so there are more pictures of Sanctus Ambrosione or Saint Ambrose. As you can see, he's seen again with books or at a desk. There's an ink pot. There's a kind of a quill, and gradually you see all of these items of furniture or articles of everyday use show acts of reading as well as writing in all these original. Here we have another older bas relief from somewhere in Greece. Again, a classroom scene. As you can see, this is very clearly a classroom scene. There is one teacher who seems to be lecturing. There are two students who look quite unhappy, sitting, and there is one student who's standing outside, may I come in? But, or somebody who has entered late, as you can see. He seems to have, no one is paying any attention to him. He seems to be carrying a small school bag. But the difference, what is the difference in this depiction with others? In that here the book is a rolled up thing, it's a scroll, it's not a volumen. This, or a codex, see this form of the book, where you have two covers, you have a spine, and you have consecutive pages, is known as the codex form of the book, C-O-D-E-X, not codex, codex. Okay, how this form, this is an earlier form, is the scroll or the volumen. It is a rolled up sheet of paper, now, or papyrus, or parchment. Now the problem with this is that there are no page numbers here. And let's say if you have a scroll, if you continue reading, you have to open the scroll further and further. If you want to go back, then you have to roll up the scroll again. And if think of a problem, think of a roll of toilet paper. If it ever unrolls, how difficult it is to roll it back and put it back. So the problem with the scroll is that it's not easy to handle, or you cannot have an index. Here, if I want to find in a book, the book will give me an index. If I want, let's say if it's a book on the Indian freedom movement, if I want to find out Mahatma Gandhi, then I can see at the index and it will tell me which page number to go to. For the roll or the volumen, the index is not possible because it can't really tell you that way. However, in the computer there is something called a scroll button. So we have returned to the older vocabulary where you have an infinitely long page. But of course in a computer, in an HTML page, it can go on and on and on, like the scroll. That's why the scroll button, the term has been used. But in this form of the book, that is not necessary. You can just refer to the page number. Though, you must remember that the early books of this kind, let's say the Bibles which were printed, did not have page numbers. They had only the titles of the book of the Bible. So Genesis or Exodus or Leviticus or Prophets. So even if you look at the early Bengali Bibles, which were written and translated and printed by the Sri Rampur missionaries in the early 19th century, you will find that they lack page numbers. It's only after a time that the page numbers become common. Anyway, so here you see another kind of a act of reading going on. People sitting on chairs comfortably. That has always been the case in depictions of readers in the Western world. So they're sitting on a chair, they hold large scrolls, the teacher does not have any notes, and then there is the student. All of them also seem to be wearing interesting boots. And as therefore reading progressed, books became more plentiful. See, the thing is, the point I'm trying to make is there is a moment in the history of reading that books become easily available. In South Asia or India, this was always the case. I mean, people may not have been very literate, but the palm leaf manuscript was easily produced. And that is why, maybe in India, we are not very concerned about preserving or conserving. We don't have a culture of conservation. as opposed to the West. The West conserves everything, every little artifact. In our world, the books are either, the palm leaf manuscripts are expendable because you have more palm leaves. You just need to write them. So often they are burnt or thrown in under the water or often buried in the ground. Not always voluntarily. Sometimes libraries are burnt. Sometimes, people. There are many such incidents in Indian history where, if you look at the life of the Sant Tukaram, he wrote prayers in an idiom called the abhang, which the upper caste were unhappy with. They threw them away into the water. And so you will constantly hear these stories about manuscripts being destroyed, thrown away, etc. But there's a very long life of manuscripts. And even now, if you go to the website called the National Manuscripts Mission, doesn't do a great deal of work, but you will find that India, the manuscripts are everywhere. I mean, there are libraries with manuscripts which have lasted for centuries. In fact, and this is counterintuitive, you think that if a book is printed, it will last much longer. I mean, there are more copies, right? You print 500 copies, 1,000 copies. Manuscripts is only one of a kind. In India, it's slightly different. I do research in the 19th century. Often I find it more difficult to find a printed copy of a book than, let us say, a manuscript. And this is not common sense. This does not. In Europe, however, things completely changed after the invention of the printing press. Before that, as you looked in the early slides, books had to be chained. You had to be very rich to own a book. After printing happened and after paper became cheap, you printed everything from Bibles to playing cards. In fact, the two of the first things which were printed in Europe were, on the one hand, the sacred, the Bible, and the profane, the playing cards. And then gradually other things began to be printed. Printing was the reason, one of the major reasons behind the Christian Reformation. That is the rise of Protestantism. Without the printing press, the church would not have divided into two sections, the Catholics and the Protestants. Martin Luther wouldn't have been able to split the Christian church had it not been for printing. At one point of time, Martin Luther alone accounted for 1/3 of all pamphlets which were circulating in Europe. His entire Christian Reformation was driven by the act of printing. If you read the novel Hunchback of Notre Dame by Victor Hugo, you will find that, which takes place before printing, right? I mean, historically, or at the time of printing. There is one episode in which one of the characters, some church father, he goes on a huge rant against the printed book. And he points at the church and says, the print will destroy the church. He says that this is going to destroy the church, which is exactly what happens in the case of the Vatican. So as printing becomes more general and affordable, it's still not widely affordable, you begin to see strange things like this, where you have a kind of a rotating table with 4 books. It's like having 4 windows or 4 tabs open on your computer. You want to look at 4 books, or you have even more spectacularly a book engine. It's like a wheel where you have books all across, so you just need to turn the wheel. There's a gear system, and whatever book you want to read will come on front of your eyes. Of course, this is expensive. And this is like, again, opening multiple tabs, multiple windows on your laptop, on your desktop, so that you can toggle between them. In the 16th and 17th centuries, people were trying to do these things. I mean, of course, this was not common. Engines such as this is very rare. And you find here one of the earliest libraries, not one of the earliest, but one of the most modern libraries. This is in modern day Holland, the University of Leiden, where you see a reading room. And I want to sort of draw your attention to some features of this library. It is very much like a modern library. You see, if you think of ancient libraries, obviously we don't know what they look like. Think of the Library of Alexandria, which was burnt. But whatever accounts we have of the library is that those libraries had scrolls. And scrolls, at any given point of time, there would be this sort of noise, noise in the library. There are people handling the scrolls and also reading not silently, but murmuring. There's always a steady hum. Nowadays, we know that you're supposed to be silent in libraries. You're supposed to read silently, but that could not have been the case in the Library of Alexandria. Now here you have a modern library, where strangely enough pets are allowed. Dogs and cats seem to have wandered around with the students. These seem to be students from the University of Leiden. They're all wearing gowns, as was compulsory at that period. And you can also see, if you blow up this picture, and I can't blow it up for you right now, that it says here mathematics, philosophy, literature. So you also see the division of subject matter. Okay. What you also cannot see there are still, these books are chained. There are small chains which actually hold these books to the shelves. So you cannot actually go away. There are some catalogs here. There is a book, there is a globe and an astrolabe. There are also people greeting each other inside the library. It's also a social space. People are meeting. There's a lot of light. There are some people looking for books, some people having a chat. The modern library as we know it is coming into being. Nowadays, of course, most librarians would not allow you to, no library would allow you to bring pets. They will also not allow you to talk inside the library in the way these two men, of course, seem to be having one bowing with the hat, one greeting him, and a full-fledged social interaction inside the library. But people still talk about in the libraries and do other things as well. So if you look at such spaces, or this is one of the most famous libraries in the world, the Trinity College Library in Cambridge. And this is, in fact, you can also see here one of those revolving structures. You have 4 books which you can open. Now, these are all cubicles inside the library, and you could sit on, and these are all, this furniture is all designed by a man called Christopher Wren, one of the greatest architects of England at that time, who created all the major buildings. Trinity College Library has also some of the oldest. They have the manuscript of Milton's Lycidas, which many of you will have studied or will study. And I have a personal memory of this as well, because when I was doing my doctoral work in Cambridge, my supervisor was the librarian of this particular library, a man called David McKittrick. So every 1 month, when I would need to see my supervisor, he would ask me to come at the unearthly hour of 9 o'clock in the morning, which was very difficult for me because I'm not an early riser. And especially in the cold of England, getting up and cycling to... And so we would have to park downstairs, walk across the quadrangle, and make my way up to this library where our supervisions would take place on one of these benches. And he said, oh, well, this is designed by Christopher Wren, which made me feel sufficiently awestruck. And then eventually, of course, it just became a space where you did work. This is also, when you read Virginia Woolf's The Room of One's Own, is that in your syllabus? Or yes. You will find that in that, have you already done it, or it's in the future? So those of you who have done it will remember that she is talking about a library which does not allow her to enter. She is walking along the backs of a place called Oxbridge. She's actually walking along in Cambridge, and she suddenly remembers that there is this place where the manuscript of Milton's Lycidas is kept. And she thinks that, why don't I go and see it? And as she's about to enter this place, somebody says that, if you want to come in, a fellow of the college needs to introduce you. And she's very upset at that. And she says, I'll never come into this library again if it excludes me, etc. Let them, and then the rest of the essay is also about inclusions and spaces which do not allow women access. Now, she was half correct, half not correct in that even now you just can't walk into that library. You would need some kind of a letter or so on and forth. I mean, you would be stopped downstairs and asked for some kind of ID, as she was in the 1920s. But it is one of the, as I said, greatest libraries that you could think of. Now, therefore, since we talk about women and reading, women readers are even more difficult to historically recover. When did women read? When did they have the time for reading? Where did they read? And of course, all this is also part of is a function of your privilege. If you're from a wealthy family, if you have the opportunity to read, then you read early. So here we have 2 examples of readers from the Western world and the Arab world. A woman reading in Greece again, these are from some pottery or some artwork. She's reading a scroll, whereas here, from the Arab world, there is a woman reading a kind of a miniature book. And you can see these are rare instances. Or here, you have a more modern, more recent example of a woman reading a very, very small book. Now, this book, a pocket book, is obviously meant for pleasure. This whole picture seems to show someone who's enjoying what they're doing. Now, this is, as I said, something which happens quite late. Pocket books themselves are not invented before the 16th century. There's a man in Venice called Aldus Manutius who first starts printing pocket books, which actually would go into your pocket, and which you can more interestingly hide, especially if it's something you don't want others to find out about. If you have read Sheridan's play called The Rivals, you will find that at the beginning there is the heroine, Lydia Languish, who's reading all kinds of romantic tales, and the moment her aunt comes in, she hides everything under the pillow, behind the closet, and puts religious books in their space, which meant that books had to be small, which you could hide. So if you're reading something which your parents don't or your guardians don't want you to read, you could quickly hide them. And therefore, this kind of reading which is forbidden, or reading which is transgressive, or reading which is not suitable, is also a feature of reader strategies. If you remember the first story of Pagla Dashu by Shukumar Rai, you will find that there is a student in the class who's always the first to offer his book when the teacher asks for it. And then one day when the teacher asks for the grammar book, he quickly gives the grammar book, which is wrapped in green cloth. But unknown to him, his fellow students have replaced the grammar book with a detective story. And when the teacher opens the book, he said, Joshobonto Daroga Rom Horshok Kahini, ei tomar grammar book, then he's punished and he's completely puzzled. That's how his grammar book has turned into a Daroga and Romanchok story. So you will find many such stories, many such accounts of conscious or unconscious reading. Another example of a very, very lavish book. Now, this is something I like showing everyone. Look at these three pictures. These are, if you look at them closely, they'll sort of seem South American, and they are indeed from the Aztec or the Mexican world, where when the Spanish first landed, they encountered this book. It was quote-unquote discovered by a man called Mendoza, and therefore it goes under the name Codex Mendoza. Now, it is like a modern-day comic book. Sometime in the 15th century or early 16th century, this book was handwritten and hand-colored. Now, look at what is happening. It is a guidebook. Somebody is being taught to make fire. Somebody is being punished in front of a fire. Somebody is being taught to do housework. You're being taught to row a canoe. You're being taught basic carpentry. Here you have certain kinds of ceremonial headdresses. Here you have a kind of, again, a classroom scenario. Somebody is teaching someone else. There are word balloons. There are speeches. There are things being taught. There is a master and a teacher. And this, if you can look at this book online, just Google Codex Mendoza. It's one of the most spectacular books that you will ever see. And it comes from a civilization which we think is pre-literate, which does not write. This is a guidebook or a book of everyday behavior, of customs, of rituals, which, however, unite not just the written word, but also the painted image, the drawn object. So, in fact, many of the early books that I have been showing so far are actually both written as well as illustrated. So, going back to this particular drawing, you will find another instance of that. Look at the balance between a page where there is printing, and this is all drawn by hand. So every time, especially in the 16th and 17th century, a book would be printed, you would have the printed page, then somebody would sit down and draw these, and this might differ from book to book. So if you were a buyer, if you had a library, you would only order the printed sheets, the unbound sheets of a book. Then you would ask your artist and depending on how much you could afford to pay him to make these decorations, this large T, these various kinds of ornamentations, and then therefore two copies of the same book could be different depending on what kind of ornamentation or illustration or rubrication, as it was called, was carried out. And then the book was folded, sheets were folded and bound and put in a library. So we see this kind of books with both mechanical labor, that is to say a machine printing the text, as well as human labor, manual labor, which made up a book. Nowadays, of course, we don't do that. We print a book and pictures through the same technology. But there was this intermediate period where, and if you see the film Name of the Rose, or look at read the novel by Umberto Eco, you will find that there is a scriptorium where such things took place. You wrote the story, you wrote the books, and then the painters or the artists took over drawing and creating this fabulous artwork. The same thing happened with Buddhist and Jain manuscripts, which you will see are also fabulously illustrated. The more, the richer the owner was or the patron was, the more illustrations you could afford to carry. Now let me come to the last part of my talk, which brings us up to the more or less the modern period, the 19th century. We are looking at a scene from London, from something called a circulating library. Now, what is the difference between a circulating library such as this, Moody's Library 1842, and the library of Samuel Tarly? The earlier library that we saw is not a book library where you can borrow books from. The borrowing library, you see, comes into being round about this time because people want to read at home. The library is a space where you can go and read at the tables. But you may also wish to read at home. In the middle of the 19th century, people were buying books. Books were affordable. You could keep them at home, but they were not always affordable. Look at this. It's a novel. New Grub Street. This is a novel by George Gissing, which was published in the 1880s. Now you can see that this is in 3 volumes. Volume 1, Volume 2, and Volume 3. Now it was almost compulsory in the 19th century for every novel to be published in 3 volumes. Why? That does not make sense. Why? What is the logic behind that? The logic is thus. Every volume, or 3 volumes, had a very high price, which was 31 shilling 6 pence. Nowadays we don't use pound shilling pence, but remember, 12 pennies made a shilling, 20 shillings made a pound, 21 shillings made a guinea, and 31 shillings 6 pence was a guinea and a half. Now that's a lot of money. Even today, for 1.5 pounds in London, maybe you could buy half a pint of beer in a cheap pub, or buy a kilogram of potatoes. In the mid-19th century, that was a lot of money, so very few people could afford to buy novels. So then where did they read novels? They would go to these libraries. Who would have these novels? They would buy them from the publishers at very low prices, not 31 shillings, but maybe 12 shillings. They would lend out to the public. So if you were a reader, if you had a library card at Moody's, you paid a yearly fee of 1 guinea. And for that, you could take out 3 books at a time. But not 3 titles, 3 volumes. So which meant that Moody made a profit, or Moody made its arithmetic work by splitting every title into 3 parts. So they would be actually, in a sense, lending out the same book thrice. That was the arithmetic. So every novelist had to write enough words to run to 3 volumes. That is why Victorian novels are so long. Okay, it is not an accident. They were not masochists that they wrote very long novels so that some people did. I mean, the Dickenses but it was a market necessity because publishers also depended upon the libraries. The library would buy half their stock, and so they would not actually sell too many copies to the buying public. They would sell to the libraries. The libraries controlled the book trade, and they insisted that any novel would have to at least run to 3 volumes, which meant about 150,000 words at least. So you're looking at a time before word count, right? Somebody has sent off his manuscript to the publisher. Then the publisher says later, no, you're 10,000 words short. Can you write an additional chapter? So then you have to create that. So when we read as literature students, we often don't know all this. Why is a novel so long? The other reason why novels were long in the Victorian period were because they were like mega serials. They would come out as serials in a magazine. So you were given a certain amount of money, but the longer it ran, the better it is for the publisher, because then you don't have to start a new serial. It's like the mega serial. So again, you like chewing gum, the novel is extended. Of course, not all novelists were happy with this. Jane Austen, who came slightly before this, she wrote quite 120,000. Pride and Prejudice is about 124,000 words. But then the likes of Dickens and Thackeray and Trollope, they went the other extreme. 350,000 words, 430,000 words, etc. But equally, there were other people who just had great difficulty in writing 3-volume novels. But then this was the reality of so this was one reality where you had Moody's library. So you had to go to Moody's, Charles Edward Moody, you got your book. And after 1 year, maybe a single volume edition would come out, which was cheaper, 6 shillings. But by that time, everyone had read the novel, right? I mean, you have to, if you wanted your own copy, you have to wait for 1 year at least. Because for the first 1 year, only the 3-volume novel was in the market. And in order to do that, unless you were very rich, you had to go to the library and stand in queue. So, if it was a very popular novel, everyone was borrowing it. That would be a while before you could read it. So there was a great impatience among readers, and the writers were very unhappy with the fact that readers were not being able to read the book immediately. Nowadays we can go and order any book we want or get it. That time it was quite difficult. However, that is not the only reality. You also had books like these, which were very cheap, which were called penny dreadfuls, or shilling shockers, which were very cheap. But it was not respectable to be seen with them. Look at the titles. Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street. Varney the Vampire, or the Feast of Blood. This was not respectable. This was not things you wanted to seen with, but people read them all the time. And there was a huge market for them, which is very difficult to measure because these books have not survived very well. As opposed to something which is bound in leather, the libraries will keep them and they have survival. They have survival. These do not survive. And this is actually two of the more respectable ones. The ones which are more pornographic or more down market have not survived at all. But that also circulated among a completely different reading public. It is kind of comparable nowadays in India with the literary novel, the likes of Amitav Ghosh, Jhumpa Lahiri, etc., with, let us say, the more popular novels, the Rashmi Mansals, the Durjoy Datto, the Ravinder Singh, and so on and forth. It's roughly comparable to that, which has Chetan Bhagat began this, if you remember. That's a different story. So you're also looking at a number of reading publics. And in the mid-19th century, you had the George Eliots, the Jane Austens, the Thackeray's, the Wilkie Collins, the Dickenses, who were all read by a more sophisticated reading public. But there was another reading public who was reading this, and sometimes the same reading public was reading both of these, but they were too embarrassed to acknowledge this. This would be hidden in their pockets, and the libraries would not keep them, so we know very little about them. But these were read all the time, and at one point of time, somebody like, I think, Thackeray said that our miserable clique, we do not even have any idea about 14/15ths of the reading public, that unknown public he called it. They don't even care for what we write. They read their own stuff, and that is the fascinating part about Victorian readers. By this time, literacy is increasing. Everywhere in schools, the board system has come into, we were all part of a board, a Madhyamik board or ISC, a CBSC. So this board system came into being in the mid-19th century. There was a curriculum. The classroom became more and more the space for reading, and a new space emerged, the school library. A third space was prizes given in schools, book prizes. Many of us have received book prizes which have either made us happy or unhappy in schools. I remember the great unhappiness when I was in class 6 of my next door neighbor, a student called Lawrence Anthony, who had come first in class 6 and had been inexplicably given a copy of Chirodiner Uttam Kumar. And he said, what am I going to do with this? Why did he get that book? He was very unhappy. And I still remember it. So anyway, but this giving of school rewards, this is also a mid-19th century phenomenon where prize books became a way of transferring the agency of reading from the household to the school. And indeed, what we know as now young adult literature, then juvenile literature, begins to come into being. Books which are specifically written for children. So literacy rates are increasing. Periodicals are increasing. The output of books is increasing. And you also have new spaces for reading. For example, again, mid-19th century is the birth of the railways. So you are looking at somebody who's traveling, let us say, from London to Manchester by train, and he wants something to read on the way. The book must be an easy read. You don't want a very difficult book, maybe. The book must be cheaper, surely, than your ticket. You don't want to pay more than the price of the ticket. The book should be easily portable. It should slip into your overcoat pocket. And finally, it should be printed in sufficiently large print, because reading inside a train with the train shaking is not difficult now, but in the 19th century it must not have been easy. So all of this went into a new kind of literature, the railway library, and you see the first Indian examples of that. A.H. Wheeler and Company Private Limited. Anyone who's traveled on Indian Railways will know that there is a Wheeler bookshop. Nowadays, Wheelers only sell they also sell groceries and so on and forth. Books have sadly disappeared from their stock. But in the 1880s, copying what happened in England, you had all these railway libraries for people traveling. And in India, A.H. Wheeler and Company came into being in the 1880s, the Indian Railway Library. So the Indian people were reading. What were they reading? They were reading Rudyard Kipling, The City of Dreadful Night, unfortunately referring to our fair city, or in black and white, 1 rupee, quite a high price at that time. More from that, Willy Winky and Other Stories by Rudyard Kipling, A.H. Wheeler and Company, Indian Railway Library, number 6, 1 rupee, or Phantom Rickshaw and Other Eerie Tales by Rudyard Kipling, A.H. Wheeler of the Company. So these are fascinating examples of, in India, new kinds of reading coming into being, right? You are now reading on railway trains, and you actually have a bookshop on the railway platform. Nowadays, even now you have them, ubiquitous are, H. Wheeler it was founded by a group of business partners. One was a French, Emile Moreau. One was an Indian partner, Banerjee, N. Banerjee. I think they still own the company. I'm not sure. The history of Wheeler, I'm not entirely sure. But nowadays you will also see on railway platform the Gita Press of Gorakhpur and certain religious denominations. The Gita Press of Gorakhpur is also a very long standing. From the 1890s, they would print all versions of the Gita, including pocket Gitas for the budding revolutionary. You find that in Ghore Baire, where the character Amullo has a pocket Gita. So of course the publisher is also printing pocket Gitas for use for very portable Gita. So this kind of reading practices and reading space, I'm sort of as I said, I'm simplifying a 5,000-year-old history in a lecture of 1 hour, right? But these are all just to give you an idea, and I'll finally end with Penguin Books, which also has a kind of railway connection. You see, when you think of reading for leisure, one of the first things which comes to our mind are Penguin paperbacks. But these paperbacks have a more recent origin, 1930s. And the story goes, now like all stories, probably not entirely true. The story goes that the proprietor of Penguin Books, Alan Lane, was visiting his very good friend Agatha Christie in a village called Torquay, where she lived. And when he was returning to London and standing at the Devon railway station, he looked at the railway library, the bookstore, and said that there's really nothing here I want to read. Either very bad crime fiction or detective stories. So he thought of, why don't I start a series of popular books which will be popular but serious literature, but also very cheap, like a packet of cigarettes. And thus the idea of Penguin Books was born. These are early penguins, green penguins, which are all crime novels. So they were all color-coded. General literature was orange, crime fiction was green, Um, Theatre was maroon, books of non-fiction were light blue, theatre was yellow, and so on and forth. So they had all these color coded, and these are some of the early penguins, which, as you can see, has retained that green color thing. Why did I say that this is not entirely a true story? Possibly, yes, maybe, but now we know that the idea of penguin, or we think we know, the idea of penguin was given to Alan Lane by a very unlikely person, who is more famous in Indian history as its first and very feisty foreign minister, V.K. Krishna Menon. Now, Krishna Menon, before he became part of Nehru's government, was in London, and he was a publisher. He was the one who created Pelican books. You see, we read Boris Ford's History of English Literature, the Pelican book. That was curated by Krishna Menon, a little-known part of his career, which we remember him much more as a kind of a figure in Indian bureaucracy and the government. But Krishna Menon may have also been instrumental behind the Penguin books, and eventually Penguin books became a kind of a shorthand for good reading. You even had Penguin books could be bought like from a slot machine. You put in 6 penny, you got a book, and these were called, and it's a bit difficult to pronounce, Penguin Cubator. Penguin plus incubator, Penguin Cubator. But that didn't last very long. But nonetheless, the coming of Penguin books, coming of Penguin paperbacks, was another and perhaps one of the most recent instances of making books more cheaper, more universal, more pervasive. India, that it came very quickly to India after independence. Paperback books, Hind paper books, Orient paperback books, all of them began printing in English, Hindi, Urdu, and so on and forth. But that's another story, maybe for some another lecture if I ever get an opportunity. Thank you for your time and your attention. I hope I've not exceeded my time.
Okay, so thank you so much, sir, for sharing your valuable insights with us. And as I mentioned earlier that I did not like Game of Thrones when it was in my syllabus, but then peer pressure happened. Take a bow, Dr. Priyanka Chakraborty, and I watched it. And I can quote, sorry, I cannot provide a citation, sir. There's one moment in the season. Yes, I will ask them. There, Samuel says to John that, John, you're better than me at everything except reading. And we know how true is that. So, on that note, anyone have any questions for sir?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Not much of a question, but I was in half a mind to whether to come today or not. But after I heard sir last time in the boardroom, I thought I can give many things a miss. But what attracts me basically is more than literature, history. And this history is very fascinating for me, and the way he elaborates the history, that is more interesting and fascinating. Okay? And I just want to share two things with you. My first impressions of books were not school books, were those colored pictures from Kashidashi and Kritivashi Ramayana and Mahabharata that my grandmother used to share with me. Leather-bound volumes with golden letters. They were her wedding presents dating back to 1932. And my second thing that has gone etched into my memory, my grandmother was 15 years old then, in 1932. And second thing that was etched in my memory is 3rd February 1997. Okay? The day Calcutta Book Fair was gutted in fire, I was standing in front of the Standard Literature stall. Standard Literature is no more now. And Standard Literature was burning. People were breaking the window pane. There was a glass window. And everybody was just lifting out single volumes of Encyclopedia Britannica that was displayed there. I did not know then what would somebody do with one volume of Britannica? You would need a set to complete. So, when we study literature, there is no end to it. There are so many dimensions, and every book has a history to it. Every book has a story to tell. I have a wish. I was telling Sir last time, it's not so much a comment, but I'm very excited after hearing this lecture, that, sir, there should be something on the history of printmaking and the history of books in Bengal, where we live, where we come from. There is so much of work. He was just sharing that he had brought out 16 titles have come out under his supervision from the Jadavpur University Press, which is not a small number for a university press to bring out, okay, in a year in the Calcutta Book Fair. So if this is Sir's forte, if Sir could make a project out of it, and that would be wonderful. The, is it? Okay. And just one small thing, sir. I just have one area where I would like to just share a thought with you, is that I think, the printing definitely comes from the Western world, and we have this history of colonization, and that brings a lot of things to us. And had that history not been how it is, things might have different. That is a matter of speculation. But in India, you see, we did have a kind of an indigenous education system where people from various communities did learn their trade practices, and these were documented. And if you look at the history of the university that flourished in our own state at Navadvip, Nadia, as late as Sir William Jones's time, Nadia had about 1,500 scholars and 5,000 pupils, all studying gratuitously. And this 5,000 pupils came from various parts of the country. Okay, and there would have been a lot of handwritten books, so to say, and the subjects were varied. Okay, and they were from veterinary sciences, okay, to many things. Okay, from the Brahminical knowledge systems of the Shastras to veterinary sciences and many things. I just wanted to share this. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, PRC sir. Do you have any questions? Any fact checking, anything? Okay. I don't know. They can have it. Okay, so thank you so much everyone for turning up today, and if any GOT fans over there, if you can remember that Queen Cersei has proved that power is power, but after today's talk I would agree to Peter Baelish that knowledge is power, and MRC ma'am has something to say. Yes.
No, I don't have anything to say about knowledge being power. Please.
Okay, so ma'am, yes.
Case comes up in a rather unlikely debate, and this is probably nothing to do with chapbooks, but I just thought I would share this with you. And this is not an answer to your question, because obviously the same text circulating in different forms and formats, even sometimes it may be exactly the same textual matter. So let's say if you have a communist manifesto printed in luxurious leather, in a very expensive leather edition, is it the same book as something printed on very cheap paper for a worker's edition? I mean, does it remain the same? This is a question which has been asked. In Richardson's case, he had, after his death, he had a nephew who was a church person, a man of cloth, who was a very pious man, but was completely opposed to novels and did not want his grandfather's work to be in circulation. So this, or Jatha's work to be, uncle's work to be in circulation. This came up very notably in a speech made in 1842 by a man, again we know for an entirely different reason, Thomas Babington Macaulay. We know him for his policies which led to the Anglicization of our education. But in 1842 he gave two extraordinary lectures. You should all read them if you can, in the House of Commons on copyright. He was talking about copyright, and the necessity of modern copyright law and intellectual property, and the right of the author to be read after his death. And he was comparing two copyright regimes and saying that if our older copyright regime stood, then Richardson's family could forever stop his books from being circulated, because he had this nephew who disapproved of novels. And he was trying to explain why we needed, I think that's a different argument. There's nothing to do with chapbooks, but also in a sense there's a relevance, because he was talking about the intellectual property, authorship, the length of copyright, etc. And that speech by Macaulay shows extraordinary mastery of literature and literary issues, which again, I mean, as any student of literature would find worthy of revisiting. But again, I mean, as far as alternative models of books being published, Dickens's work often, think of Pickwick Papers. They circulated before they were published as a novel as single numbers. They were pirated all across the world, including in Calcutta. A man called William Rushton in 1838 published the extremely rare Calcutta edition of Pickwick Papers, of which very few copies can be found. So the control that a author is supposed to have over his or her work is never absolute. The way in which a work is circulated will mean that there are various different acts of reading taking place, and sometimes some readings can be against the grain. I mean, not in a way that the author would have liked to have been read at all. So this is, especially in the 18th century when we're talking about, this is much more random, because again the copyright laws, modern copyright laws had not come into being, and the author had not in complete control, or the publisher did not have complete control over the ways in which works are. Not an answer to a question, but a reflection on Samuel Richardson and his unwitting role in the copyright debate.